Hello girls, and welcome to my second attempt at making a video. I hope that the first one was a success. I'd really appreciate it if at the end of this one you could let me know if you're finding them helpful, because I have no idea whether they are or whether they aren't. And I would find that much more helpful than if you send me your work to be marked, because I want you to do your own marking, and not just because I'm lazy, but because it's very difficult for me to mark online pieces of work without making comments online, and believe me, it gets very complicated. The key thing is that you learn from this, that you learn from your mistakes and from your corrections. Just looking at a mark at the end of the day is not actually learning. It's noticing what mistakes you make and learning from those. Now we're going to start this one. It's the world of marvels and romance, all about the Globe Theatre at the time of William Shakespeare. And it was a much more challenging exercise I gave you, not because the language was that much more challenging, but because the questions, I think, were. So well done if you gave it a go. I'm going to set you challenging work, girls, whatever set you are in, because I think everybody can rise to a challenge, and you mustn't be limited by what people say you are, or are you what you are not capable of. You can all do more than you realise and more than you think. The first thing to do when you get a passage is to read it through very carefully. As this is a homework, I said look up any new vocabulary, write it in your vocabulary books. It's a good idea to keep a vocabulary book for yourselves, so that you can build up your own personal vocabulary list and learn from them. Once you think you know what's going on, then we're going to start looking at the questions. And my first question was a big one. What information does he give to make the theatre seem so exciting? Now, looking at that as it is, it's such a broad question, and you're in year 7, so it's probably hard to know where do I start. You end up writing a couple of sentences, whereas in fact it's a very, very large answer. And we're going to look at his choice of words and really teach you to stretch yourself in answering in a more thorough and complete and detailed way. So the first thing I've done is I've broken it up for you. We need to establish that the theatre was a popular pastime. So that was my first question. How do we know it was? And we're told that in almost the second sentence, I think it is, or the third sentence. And that is that 15,000 people went to the city's playhouse every week. So again, you are working out for yourself, hopefully, that it was exciting because we know that many people went there, and that 15,000 people, in fact, went every week. Remember, the population of London was much, much smaller than it is today, and that was an awful lot of people. Next one is a really challenging question, and that is looking at language. How does this sentence make the theatre sound more interesting? Whoa. And you're thinking about language here, and I've helped you a little bit by drawing you directly into that question, the statement that I want you to look at, which is this one. For 1 penny, you could leave behind the drab, overcrowded, plague-ridden streets of London and enter a world of marvels and romance. Now that is a beautifully structured sentence, says I as an English teacher. We always are influencing people by our choice of words. And here the writer is trying to influence you by his choice of words. He could have said this in a very much more boring way, which wouldn't have interested you at all. For a penny, you could go to the theatre. Yawn, yawn, yawn. Okay, I've moved on. It doesn't really thrill me at all. But he's used his persuasive powers of language to change that. And I want you to be aware of that when you're reading work. How can writing become more persuasive? So he has said this, for 1 penny you could leave behind the drab, overcrowded, plague-ridden streets of London and enter a world of marvels and romance. So instead of making it really boring, he has changed the verb you could leave behind instead of you could go. Leave behind changes it altogether. He's added in 3 adjectives, not just one, but 3 adjectives to the streets of London. And enter what? Not the theatre, but he's used a really beautiful metaphor, a world of marvels and romance. Now, I'm going to go a step further and ask you to really unpack those phrases, and I'll go through them one at a time. So the first one, you could leave behind. So I would write something like this. Here, by using the words leave behind, the writer suggests we can escape from something through the theatre. Escape sounds like Diagon Alley, doesn't it? Or stepping through the wardrobe of Narnia, into Narnia. It's an exciting prospect. Now, he hasn't just talked about the streets of London, but he's used, as I said, 3 adjectives. Drab, which means dull and dark and dirty and rather boring. Overcrowded, we all know what that means because you just need to walk down the corridors at school to know what that means. And plague-ridden, well, we're living with that at the moment. So rather than just explaining what each of those adjectives means, you need to draw out of it what he's trying to say by choosing those adjectives. Use the word adjectives because it's showing you have an understanding of language. The adjectives, drab, overcrowded and plague-ridden, tell us that most Londoners had a hard life, which was unhappy and unhealthy. We can imagine London as dirty and dark, in strong contrast to the theatre. The use of 3 adjectives compounds the ugliness and misery. And the word compounds means adds and adds and adds. He could have just said the drab streets of London, okay, or the drab overcrowded streets of London, a bit better. The drab overcrowded plague-ridden, that is really compounded and becomes much more powerful in our imaginations. So do you see what I've done with that phrase? And then moving on to the last one. And we go where? To a world of marvels and romance. That metaphor, the world. We think about the world, we think about it as a great and wondrous place, a place of excitement, of surprises, of beauty, of danger, of all sorts of unimagined things which we haven't yet explored. And the words marvels and romance tell us the marvels are going to be our reaction, we're going to be amazed by it. And the romance, of course, well, we all love romance. That means that things are going to work out where we are happy inside, where it's beautiful. So this is what I've written. Here the writer juxtaposes the streets to the world. That's another word for compares. And I'd write that in your vocabulary book if you don't know it. Juxtaposes the streets to the world. The theatre, and I've explained the world. The theatre can transport you to faraway countries like Italy and Egypt, places most would never see. Marvels and romance means that these experiences will be good and happy instead of the worry of the plague and the dirt. So I've used that, I've spotted that contrast which he has done deliberately. And that, putting those 3 sections together, would be a well-written answer. Now, my next question was, what was it about the plays themselves that was exciting? And reading from the book, we're told many of Shakespeare's plays, or your sheet, were set in exotic places such as Venice, Bohemia, or ancient Egypt. So, I have pulled that down and said these were set in exciting places where Londoners had never been and never would go. Italy, well, Bohemia, and even ancient Egypt. And just for your own interest, girls, I'm going to tell you, you don't need to know this in an answer, because unless you've got incredible general knowledge, you wouldn't. And you don't even need to write it necessarily. Italy, well, it was probably a place where Shakespeare had never been, and yet he set many of his plays in Italy because it was so romantic. He set The Merchant of Venice, he set Romeo and Juliet, Three Gentlemen of Verona, Much Ado About Nothing, to name just a few. Bohemia was the site of The Winter's Tale. And ancient Egypt, well, of course, none of us have been to ancient Egypt because that's in history. But here he describes ancient Egypt when he talks about Julius Caesar, when he writes about Antony and Cleopatra. Now, I need to add a caveat here, girls. That means a warning in a way, that don't believe Shakespeare's history because it is very, very dodgy. He's writing it for the story, much more for the facts. He plays fast and furious with the facts. But that is what we are doing. We are getting out of that. He set them in places where they had never been, never would go, and give some examples. Now, what was it about the plays that themselves were exciting? And you got this sentence in your passage. There were sword fights, clowns and pitch battles, love scenes and songs, ghosts and witches. You could write it just like that, but frankly, it's far too long a quotation. A quotation should only really be a few words long. And so what we need to do again is to pull these back down into one thing. Think about I'm just telling you this again out of interest, sword fights. Everybody loves a sword fight. There are sword fights in Romeo and Juliet, and Much Ado About Nothing, in Twelfth Night, in Macbeth, just to name a few. Pitch battles, of course, in Macbeth, and the history plays, Henry IV, Henry V. Love scenes, well, of course, we all know the famous Romeo and Juliet. And we know Much Ado About Nothing, Midsummer Night's Dream, lots and lots of those. Songs, Shakespeare's plays, he loved putting songs and music into particularly his comedies. But even in some of his tragedies, he put in songs. We've got songs in particular in Twelfth Night. I remember that because I've just done it with the Year Aids. The ghosts and the witches, well, Shakespeare was fascinated by the supernatural, as were the Elizabethans. We've got ghosts in Hamlet, and in particular, obviously, in the obvious one, which is Macbeth with its witches. So we don't need to know all that, but we can work out from that sentence that there is a lot there that people loved. Notice also, by the way, the contrast, sword fights versus clowns, love scenes versus songs, ghosts and witches. He does just put in these little contrasts to show the variety of Shakespeare's plays. So, you could say that the plays themselves were full of a variety of exciting episodes. They were full of sword fights and battles, as well as comedy and romance. They included songs and sometimes the supernatural. Right, now my next question was about paragraph 2. And I asked you about colour. How is the colour achieved? And the reason that I asked that question is because we're told, above all, there was colour. The globe used no painted scenery or movable flats, but its stage was gorgeously decorated. Massive painted pillars held up the stage canopy, where the ceiling was bright with sun, moons, and the signs of the zodiac. So I have said, despite the fact that there were no props, because that would normally give the colour, the stage itself was, short quotation, gorgeously decorated. It had painted pillars which were, short quotation, massive, and therefore would delight the eye if you wanted to add it. And the ceiling was bright, adjective there, you could have added that, was covered with the signs of the zodiac, which again would be exotic and colourful, and, quote, bright with the sun and the moon. And if you look at the bottom of my slide there, you've got some photographs of the modern recreation of the Old Globe Theatre, which is in London on the Embankment. And you can see the pillars. On the extreme right, you can see the roof. And if you look carefully, you can see there are the signs of the zodiac and the sun and the moon. So it was very bright. Now, the second half of the question would have been a long answer. I didn't put what these were worth in marks, but this is something that's a skill that's really important for you to learn. This passage really shows you how difficult it must have been to be an actor. Do you agree with this statement? Focus on the last 3 paragraphs of this passage and give reasons for your answer using evidence from the text. Now, girls, here you are asked to use the information we're given in the last 3 paragraphs and empathize. Empathize means putting yourself into the shoes of that actor. And empathize is a hugely important skill in English literature. You need to be able to do it when you're reading a passage or reading any book or poem. But I would go further and say it's a vital human learning skill, because to be a decent member of the human race, you need to be able to empathize, understand how other people feel. And there's people who don't understand how other people feel that actually are very unpopular because they don't show any sympathy or compassion. So this is something where you need to look at the facts, imagine yourself an actor on stage. Now I'm going to go through those 3 paragraphs, paragraph by paragraph, so we can look at the evidence that we're given. So this is the first one, and I'm reading. Going on stage at the Globe Theatre was a daunting experience. Daunting means frightening or nerve-wracking. The actor entered upstage from one of the 3 doors at the back. There was a stage jutting out into the middle of the yard. It was about the size of half a tennis court and bare except for a few props. And there was the audience, not just in front of him, but on his right and left as well. He was almost surrounded with 3,000 eager pairs of staring eyes. With no stage lighting, he could see the audience as clearly as it could see him. Now you need to stop and think about all those pieces of information step by step. Firstly, is going onto the stage, which is an enormous stage, half the size of a tennis court, completely bare. And he's going out into an audience. So the audience, we're told, is surrounding him, on his left, on his right, in front of him. And he is therefore, the word surrounded always makes us feel a little bit trapped, doesn't it? With 3,000 eager pairs of staring eyes. 3,000 pairs of eyes means 3,000 people. That's double the number of people who go to our school. All these people are staring at you. Can you imagine if that number of people were all looking at you? You'd be terrified to make a mistake. Now, not only that, there was no stage lighting. On a modern stage, if you've ever been in a play, the lights go down on the audience and you can almost forget about them because you can't see anything. But in those days, there was no stage lighting because the plays were performed in the afternoon at 2:00. And so that poor actor would be able to see the faces of every single person as clearly as they could see him, which would be very, very daunting. So I'm going to put that into my own words here. So we've got the stage stuck out into the audience who surrounded him. I would put in there that bit about the verb surrounding suggests this feeling of being trapped. That it must have been frightening as about 3,000 people would have been watching, 3,000 pairs of staring eyes, which means that he is constantly under scrutiny. And you could see them clearly because there was no lighting. And you can develop each of those 3 points in a little bit more detail, should you wish, like I did when I was talking to you. Next paragraph. There was no respectful hush. People carried on talking, eating, drinking, thieving, and sometimes fighting too. Once, when a crowd caught a pickpocket, they tied him to one of the stage pillars as a punishment. They cheered or hissed the actors when they felt like it, and one poet wrote that there were shouts and claps at every pause. So again, I want you to imagine if you step in front of all these people, instead of them all stopping and listening to you, they all carried on making a huge racket. I know exactly how that feels as a teacher, and it would be much, much worse to be on stage in front of 3,000, trying to keep everybody's attention in a class who are not behaving or perhaps throwing things around or behaving badly would be just a nightmare. So that's what he's got to deal with. A whole lot of people who are not listening to him. And believe me, if they caught a pickpocket, they'd be a lot more excited about the capturing of the pickpocket than they would be about you on stage. Cheering and hissing the actors, so they're constantly making personal judgments about you, aren't they? And one poet wrote that there were shouts and claps at every little pause, so you couldn't even have your dramatic pauses or stop for breath or keep concentration. It must have been hell. Right, into your own words now. So, these are the facts. He had to struggle to keep the attention of the audience, that people would continue eating, talking, stealing, and even fighting whilst he tried to act, which would be a very hard thing to make it very difficult to keep the attention of the audience. And it was hard to create a character or an atmosphere when the audience, quote, shouted and clapped at every pause. You might be wondering, if you're sort of sharp-eyed, why I've got those brackets around the EDs on shouted and clapped. That's because if you look at the actual script, we were told it was shouts and claps. So I haven't actually quoted accurately. That is why I have put the ED in brackets, because I've changed the quotation slightly, and that is how you should write a quotation if you change it slightly. And then the last paragraph is this: even more off-putting were the gallants in the most expensive seats in the gallery rooms. Being so near the stage, they could distract the audience by making fun of the actors. Oh, lordy. Right, so remember in your notes you would have seen that a gallant was a fine young man who was probably very vain about his beautiful clothes. Imagine sort of a movie star or something like that, some sort of fancy celebrity. That's what he was, almost. And there he was, sitting practically on the stage, in the most expensive seats, and therefore I should imagine a lot of the audience would be watching him. Now he'd probably quite enjoy that perhaps, and be showing off his clothes, conversations going on, perhaps flirting with the girl that he fancied, waving at somebody in the audience, or worse, making fun of the actors. Perhaps he was mimicking them or laughing at them, or if you lifted your hand, he was lifting his hand. It, again, would have been a huge challenge. So you'd put that into your own words. Furthermore, some of the wealthy patrons were sitting in very prominent positions right near the stage, and they often distracted the audience, perhaps by talking, showing off their clothes, or even mimicking the actors. They were fascinating to the rest of the audience, so the actor had a real struggle to keep the attention of everyone. And that's it. You have got through it, girls, and you've got through listening to this, which I see, to my horror, is 24 minutes long, so well done if you did. I hope that was useful to you. Do let me know if you found it useful, if it was too long, etc., etc. I'd love to hear from you. Just put it in the Show My Homework in your notes there. Take care, everybody, and I hope that you are able to keep learning, keep reading, and doing everything as best you can. This is what will sort out the mice from the men, the real people who are serious about their studies, and the ones who are playing in the shallows. So I hope you're one of those ones who will go far and work hard now. Take care. Lots of love. Keep safe. Bye-bye.